Hello friends, in this video we'll see what is SLA, RPO, RTO, reliability, predictability and performance. So SLA is Service Level Agreement. So when you consume any services from Azure, so you have multiple services offered, right? So when you consume services, for each and every services, there are different SLAs. For example, for the virtual machine itself, for the virtual machine, if you are using standard hard disk, then you have 95% of SLA. If you are using standard SSD disk for the same virtual machine, then it will be 99.5%. If the virtual machine has premium SSD, then it will have 99.9% of SLA. So for deploying the virtual machine itself, you have different SLAs. So these different SLAs are calculated based on what type of hard disk you are going to use. So these are the disks what you are going to use for the virtual machine, what you are going to create. So this is the virtual machine. You are going to use standard HDD, then you have 95%. If you are using standard SSD, then you will have 99.5% of SLA. And if you are using premium SSD, then 99.9% of SLA. For the virtual machine, if it is provisioned in availability set, then the SLA will be 99.95%. Availability set is within the same data center, but multiple racks. If the virtual machine is provisioned in different zone, which is availability zone, then you have 99.99% of SLA. Because in availability zone, what you are doing is basically you are creating the virtual machine in multiple zones. So you have zone 1 and there is a zone 2. And these two zones are in different data center. So this is in data center 1, this is in data center 2. Whereas in availability set, within the same data center, for example, data center 1, and you have multiple racks, the virtual machines are spread across multiple racks. So that is the difference when you see availability set and availability zone. If I take other examples like function, Kubernetes, web app, container. So these are nothing but platform as a service. For all these services, you have 99.95% of SLA. If I take traffic manager, then for this, the SLA will be 99.99%. If I take Azure DNS, for this, you have 100% SLA. So basically, Azure DNS is always online. There is no outage whatsoever. For traffic manager, there is little outage. And for all this platform as a service, so these are all platform as a service. For these, we have 99.95% of SLA. So whenever you are designing any infrastructure based on the Azure cloud services, you need to check what are the SLAs provided for each of the services which you are going to deploy on your environment. Based on that, you will have high availability and scalability. Let us now understand what is RPO and RTO. RPO is Recovery Point Objective. RTO is Recovery Time Objective. Let me share an example to understand how RPO and RTO works. Suppose there is a banking industry. There is a bank which is called as Cloud Bank. So this is the bank name, and they have their services on the Azure. So this is zone 1. This is zone 2. They have the virtual machine and they have SQL database. Also for the SQL database, there is a HA which has been configured, or always on has been configured, and this copy is in Central US and this is in East US. Now these virtual machines are in East US. So this will be the app tier. There is also a load balancer which has been configured. Now there are multiple users who are accessing this particular banking site. So these are the users who are accessing the banking site. Let me use the color. So these are the users who are accessing the banking site via internet. If there is an outage or an event which has caused zone 1 to fail, so this zone 1 with the virtual machine for the app tier has failed. There is one virtual machine which is available in zone 2, and this virtual machine is able to write to the database and commit the transaction whatever the users are doing. So in this particular case, let us take an example of 9:30 a.m. The users have logged into the banking website. At this particular time, the website was working fine. So it was working fine. At 10 a.m., there was an outage of zone 1. And 11 a.m., the outage was restored. For the end user, there was no impact because they had another virtual machine, and using the virtual machine, they were able to commit to the database whatever transaction they were doing. So they were doing some transaction. It was getting committed over this particular virtual machine and coming to this database. This is the outage and this is the time for the restore. The time difference between an outage and the restoration point is called as a recovery time objective. So this is 1 hour outage. So we have 1 hour of RTO. So the time difference between an outage and the time when it was restored, there is a time difference between 10 to 11. This difference will be your RTO. So this is when your services were brought back. So it took almost 1 hour to bring your services. So that is the reason 1 hour will be the RTO. Now consider, because there is no impact here, the user were able to do the transaction without any issues. Considering the same example, if both the zone, I will write it in red color. So if both the zone fails, which is zone 1 and zone 2 has failed, to bring back these two zones, how much time it is going to take? Say for example, 9:30 website was working fine. 10 a.m. there was an outage, and 11 a.m. it was restored. Both the zones were working fine at 9:30. 10 a.m. there was an outage, and it took almost 1 hour to restore the services. So this difference again will be the RTO, which will be 1 hour. So this is also fine because 1 hour outage and there is no impact to the data. But only problem is users are not able to connect via any of these virtual machines. In the previous scenario, there was one zone which had failed and there was another virtual machine which was available. So the transaction were getting committed using this virtual machine. This is the first scenario. This is the second scenario. In first scenario, only one zone failed. There is no issue. User were able to transact via another virtual machine to the database. But in second scenario, the entire zone 1 and zone 2 failed, and user were not able to transact via both the virtual machine. So in this scenario, users were unable to do any transaction. So this is fine because even though they were not able to do the transaction, both the zones are down. There is no impact to the data. No impact to the data. So after 1 hour, services were restored. So now comes RPO. What is RPO? If you take the same scenario again, there is a data center, and there are zones, zone 1, zone 2, there is virtual machine, there is also virtual machine, there is a web application which was used by there were multiple users who are accessing the web application, and there is the SQL database, and it also has read-only copy. Whenever the user is doing any transaction, because they were having 1 hour of outage from 10 to 11. 10 to 11, they were having both the services, both the zones went down, and whatever users they were transacting, that is not getting committed to the database. So it is not getting committed to the database. User gets the error in the browser saying, okay, retry after some time. This is still okay because the transaction is not committing to the database. That is also fine. The data will remain as it is. Whatever the data during the outage between 10 to 11, it remains the same. And whatever the data which the users are going to transact for that particular transaction, they are getting the error. So there are no new transaction which is allowed by the web application because it will not be a consistent data. So let us assume that during this particular outage of 1 hour in East US, the entire region failed. This entire region failed. This zone failed. This also failed. And the East US SQL database, that also failed. Now, whatever data which was committed to the SQL database, this particular data, because it is already failed, and the copy which was supposed to go to central US, there is a data loss of 5 minutes or for 15 minutes. Example. Now, the users who were doing the transaction in this particular SQL database, there was the transaction of this much of dollars, while sending the same data from East US to the central US, the database lost some of the transaction. So this will be called as invalid data. Now, the business doesn't accept this much of RPO. So RPO is basically how much of data loss can a business accept. In a banking industry, if there is a 5 minutes of data loss or 15 minutes of a data loss, it will be a huge impact for the banks. So that is why the banking industry or any financial industry, the RPO will be always 0. So for non-critical businesses, For non-critical business, that is okay. Even if one day data loss also, it is okay for them. But for stock exchange, financial institutions, and any other institutions related to the finance like forex and airports. So these institutions will have very strict RPO and RTO. The RPO will be 0%, RTO will be 5% or 5 minutes. They can accept only 5 minutes of outage or 15 minutes of outage or at max 1 hour of outage. So this is the agreement what the organization will have between the cloud service provider and the organization for RPO and RTO. To summarize, RPO is how much of data loss a business can accept. RTO is how much time to restore the services. Let us understand what is reliability. Whenever you deploy services on the cloud, you have the services on Azure and you have deployed web application in both the location, Europe and US. These web applications are connected using Traffic Manager. The end user is accessing the web application using the Traffic Manager. If one of the region fails, so for example, if this region has gone down, there is no impact for the user who is accessing the website. The website is only failed in this region. So the ability to withstand any failure is called as reliability. So you are building your infrastructure in such a way that even if there is a failure of any of the services, there is another region or another zone which will take over the services. So this is called as decentralizing. Your services are decentralized. Let us now understand what is predictability. Whenever you have deployed any services like virtual machine, web application, SQL, you have estimated some performance. When you are designing your infrastructure, whatever you have estimated, you need to get the same estimated performance and the cost which you have predicted. So this is called as predictability. Even if there is any event which has happened at Azure, there might be an outage of a region or outage of any particular services at the Azure, your performance and the cost is not going to impact. If you need the performance which you have estimated, you can simply scale the virtual machine. Even by scaling, you are able to manage the cost what you have estimated. So this is called as predictability. So basically, You predict the performance and the cost for the services which you are going to deploy on Azure cloud. Let us now understand what is performance. So before going to the performance, we need to know what are the 5 pillars of the cloud architecture. Whenever you are going to design any architecture on the cloud, you need to consider these 5 pillars, which are reliability, cost, operational excellence, performance, and security. So these are the 5 pillars based on which you are going to design your infrastructure on the cloud. Let us now see performance. Whenever you are going to deploy any of the cloud services, you need to understand what is the requirement for the business and what level of performance is required by the services which you are going to deploy. Based on that, you are going to size your services. If you are sizing the virtual machine, you can scale the virtual machine either using manual scaling or auto scaling. Some of the services like load balancer will be auto scaled. So this is automatically scaled by Azure itself. There is no need for any user intervention. Whenever there is a high traffic at the load balancer, Azure will automatically scale the load balancer. And also, if we are using standard HDD for the virtual machine, we cannot expect the virtual machine to give the performance of premium HDD. For each of the services, we need to estimate what is the performance required at each service level. Based on the requirement of the performance, we deploy those services onto the Azure cloud platform. Thank you for watching the video. If you like the content, please subscribe and share the video. Thank you and take care.